Alex here with a video on legal nuts and bolts. In this video I'm going to cover the Constitution. I thought a lot about how I was going to do this video because the Constitution is such a complicated and gigantic issue. So I decided I was going to really give you guys a nutshell version of what it is and how it impacts court cases. This is a legal nuts and bolts video, so the Constitution obviously doesn't apply just to child custody, which is kind of my main stream here. But anyway, aside from giving the nutshell version of what it's going to do and how it plays a role in your case, I was also going to go ahead and give you an example of how I used it once. In all of my court cases that I've done, both child custody and not child custody, I've never used it except for one time, and it did publish. The time I used it, the Supreme Court of Nevada published my case, so you'll actually be able to get a really detailed look at my case and what happened and how the Constitution had a role to play in that case. So what the point of the Constitution is to impose restraints and restrictions on our legislatures. A lot of it outlines what Congress can do. A lot of it outlines the powers of the federal government versus the state government, especially the articles. And some of the amendments actually impose like restrictions on the kinds of laws that can be passed. So like the First and Second Amendment, the free speech and the right to own firearms and carry firearms, and that those are those are amendments that specifically say, you can't pass laws banning or controlling or restricting these specific things. And those actually apply not just to Congress and the federal government, but to the state and municipal legislatures. So anyway, that's basically the purpose of the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, so it's the most powerful legal instrument in the United States of America. But that doesn't mean that it's going to have an obnoxious presence in every single court case that gets filed. In fact, rather the opposite. What makes it so powerful is that it's everywhere, and it has a subtle effect pretty much in every court case. But it's not doesn't need to be cited all the time, and it really depends. Certain sensitive issues, the Constitution has a big role, like restricting your court access because you're a vexatious litigant. That's one example. I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head, but there's certain areas where it does have a big role to play, but usually it doesn't. As I mentioned, it's pretty subtle when it's, having any kind of effect. So one of the biggest subtle effects of the Constitution is the Fourth Amendment, due process. And that's all over the place. When they create any kind of process where you can challenge something, or where somebody's trying to take your property or imprison you, or there's so many examples of where due process is, and it comes in all different shapes and forms, because some people think that due process is a right to go to court and be heard by the judge and jury, and it really isn't. It's not that specific. There has to be some way that you can bring your grievance to the government, but it's not always a court hearing in front of people and the judge is looking at you and talking to you and there's a jury. That's not always what it is. Some people think it is, but it's not. So now I did promise that one of the things I wanted to jump into is, if you're going to do there's a lot of people that either don't do any research at all, or they do research like using Google and like websites that are not like, case law and statutes and stuff like that. And then there's some people that just research the Constitution and nothing else, and then they go into court and that's all they use, and then they wonder why they lose. Don't do that, please. Follow some of my other videos that explain how to control your case and how to win your case. Using the Constitution, it's rarely needed. So now, having said that, I'm glad I have an opportunity to show you a time that I did have to use it, and it worked, and it not only did it work, but it turned into case law. So it's called Falcone v. Secretary of State. That's named after me. I'm going to post a link down below. Some people probably already seen this case. It's the only one that I've been published on. Even though I've won a lot of Supreme Court cases, I've only been published on this one. And this is the one where I had to use the Constitution. So I did promise an example, and with that I'll go forward. What happened is, my ex obtained something called a fictitious address. The purpose of a fictitious address is to hide yourself from an abuser. What it is it's a fake address that looks real. So you can give this address to like landlords, banks, companies, whatever. They won't notice anything weird about it. It's not a P.O. box that looks like a real address, but it's not. It's fake. What happens is any mail that goes to that address is filtered out by the government and forwarded to your actual real address. So because you're using this fake address on all of your applications and whatever, credit cards, bank statement, banks, cable bill, in theory, an abuser shouldn't be able to find you, because if they did like a background search, all they're going to find is that fake address. And there's no real connection to your real address unless somebody physically watches you and follows you to your new house or whatever. The problem I had with it is I wasn't an abuser. And the biggest problem is how she got the address. Normally, like in a child custody case, you file a lawsuit and you go in front of court and everybody has a chance to tell their story. That's not true with the fictitious address program. All she did was go in, fill out an application, turn it in, and then the Secretary of State, well, one of their workers, looks at the application and they apply the law. The law I'm not even going to say basically. The law flat out says if an applicant provides one of the 4 or 5 examples of documents, then the secretary shall give them a fictitious address. So there's 2 problems here. The first problem is I don't have due process. I'm not involved in this process at all. They're just hearing one side of the story. All she has to show is one specific document of this list of 5. And if she does, she gets the address. The government can't even apply its discretion. In fact, if you read the case that published, the Supreme Court of Nevada specifically says the secretary can't even exercise any discretion. They're forced to give her the address. So that's the due process problem. The other constitutional issue that I raise is, and I kind of had to have some kind of underlying right to do this, because it'd be really weird if somebody got a fictitious address against some random guy and they demanded to know where they live. You really don't have a right to know where people live just out of the blue. I had a specific right, and that's because we shared a kid. And the constitutional issue that I rose was that there's a fundamental liberty interest for every parent to the custody, control, and basically to raise and be involved in the upbringing of their children. So the Supreme Court of Nevada used both of those things. First of all, they said, I have a right to, knowing where she resides. And second thing that they said is the fictitious address program in and of itself isn't unconstitutional. It's valid and it's okay. The problem is we need to create a way for somebody to challenge this when they do have a right to know where their child resides. And that is where the case basically opened a gateway to challenge the way that the secretary issues fictitious addresses. And it's outlined in my case. You can read it if you want to get the details. Basically, the legislature really failed in Nevada to create any kind of real process to challenge it. So the Supreme Court of Nevada said that you can use a writ petition, specifically a petition for writ of mandamus. You're not supposed to use extraordinary writs except in the extraordinary cases, and this is one of them, because the Supreme Court said there's just no way, there's no legal way for him to fight this, and so we're going to allow him and anyone after him to fight it using an extraordinary writ. So go ahead and read it if you want to figure out specifically what that is and what the case talks about. Anyway, for some people who are curious, I did end up following the Supreme Court's instructions. I did file that petition for writ of mandamus in the district court. The judge did order that fictitious address canceled. And I think I've mentioned in previous videos that actually was the beginning of the domino effect that led to me getting primary physical custody, sole legal custody, and ultimately terminating her parental rights and adopting our son to my wife, his stepmom. So kind of went off on a tangent a little, but I really wanted to give an example because I didn't want to just tell everyone that the Constitution is useless, because it's not. It's just, it doesn't have a huge role to play in so many cases. And in this one specific example, it had a big role to play. So now balance that out in your head. Please soak in all of what I've told you in this video. If you really want to learn a lot about what role the Constitution plays in court cases, you're just going to have to read tons and tons and tons of case law. You're not going to get a good handle on it. But the reason I didn't bring this video up earlier is because it's really not a front and center thing that's going to help you win your custody case. If anyone says otherwise, and there's a lot of websites out there that say like child support's unconstitutional and child custody and divorce is not constitutional and all that, it's just not true. I'm going to cover some videos on why the government has an interest in mediating divorce cases and child custody cases, but it's going to be outside the scope of this video, so I'm not going to go into that right now. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. See you guys next time.